Thank you very much for Christina Wildstrom for inviting me to give this keynote speech. And I would like to address one of the issues on which I've been working for the last 10 years. I have been an academic for most of my career in biology, not education. But then I joined the Spanish government as Secretary of State for Education. And my training led me to a very scientific approach. So I started by looking at the evidence, national evidence, but also evidence from international surveys to try to understand what other countries were doing that could help us improve the quality of the education system in Spain. I then joined the OECD, first as Deputy Director for Education, and then as Head of the Center for Skills. And there, my main role was to advise governments on what policies they should implement in order to overcome whatever challenges they were facing. And I think perhaps the main learning experience that I drew from talking to many governments in different countries was to understand the importance of context, why some policies which worked very well in some countries didn't work in others. So by looking at the evidence, both when we were trying to design and implement an education reform in Spain, and then advising many governments at the OECD, I realized that the evidence from large international surveys is very important. It has many strengths, but also has some weaknesses. And I think we need a more open debate about these strengths and weaknesses. And this talk is an attempt to start this debate explaining my point of view. So what does the evidence come from? The international evidence comparing different education systems in different countries. I won't go into detail because I assume you're all familiar with this, but they come mainly from TIMSS and PEARLS that look at maths, science, and reading literacy. They do so by looking at students in certain grades, in grade 4, and in the case of TIMSS, also in grade 8. And basically, they try to evaluate how much students, how much knowledge students acquire from their curriculum. PISA, which is the OECD survey, takes a different approach. It targets 15-year-olds rather than specific grades. So it actually evaluates students in different grades, as I will explain later. In some countries, this has major implications. And it doesn't relate the level of knowledge that students have with the curriculum. It basically decides what are the knowledge and skills that students need in their daily life, and it looks at how they solve problems in unfamiliar context. It's much more policy-oriented than the previous surveys. So PISA defined as its mission right from the beginning in 2000 to identify good practices by comparing top and low performing education systems, to be able to influence education policies by advising governments on what are the practices that may lead to improvements in student performance. And therefore, it claims that it has a big influence on modeling the narrative around education policies. So this is the typical result from a PISA cycle, in this case, PISA 2015. And here you see the rankings, starting at the very top with the countries where students perform better. The top performer in science in PISA 2015 was Singapore. And then you find that in this group of top performing countries is mainly countries in East Asia, but also some countries in Europe like Estonia and Finland and other countries like Canada. Then you have a group of medium performing countries, which are most European countries and other countries like the UK or the United States. And then you have low performing countries in red. And I just want to point out that there are 10 countries that couldn't fit into this axis. So the main message from this ranking, I think, is that the difference between the top performing system, Singapore in this case, and the lowest performing system, which I will name, was equivalent in this cycle to 7 years of schooling. So the differences are major. And therefore, there were huge expectations that learning from the top performing systems would lead those systems that were not doing as well to improve their quality very rapidly. If we look at what the different international surveys tell us, this is a comparison of PISA 2015 with TIMSS 2015, because they both took place in the same year. What we find is that they basically give the same results in terms of levels of student performance, despite the differences in approach that I mentioned. And you find three clusters. The very top performing systems, which are basically countries in East Asia, countries like Singapore, like South Korea, Japan, and so on. Then the cluster in the middle, which is most European countries, the UK, the United States, Australia, and so on. And then the low performing countries, which are mostly countries in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Middle East. So basically, despite some minor differences, we can conclude that in terms of student performance, international surveys are telling us a similar story in relation to those countries which perform better than others, and with huge differences between them in terms of quality, as I mentioned. So all international surveys show that there are major differences in student performance. Countries since PISA started in the year 2000 have engaged in many education reforms, and most of them have increased expenditure in education. And therefore, this learning from the top performers about what are the good practices that led to those outstanding student outcomes should have led to major improvements in student performance. And still what we see is, if we look at the results that PISA itself presents in terms of student performance between the year 2000 and the last cycle in 2018, there has been no improvement whatsoever among OECD countries, which were the core countries that PISA started evaluating, but also there have been no major changes if you look at the other participating countries that have joined in subsequent cycles worldwide. Here we see the average 3-year trend in science performance since the year 2006, which is the previous cycle when science was the main domain. And basically what you see in the middle is that in the large majority of countries, there has been no improvement in the last years whatsoever. On the left-hand side, you can see that some countries have improved, but with the exception of Singapore, which we have seen is the very top performer and continues to increase cycle after cycle. The rest are low-performing countries where gradual improvements tend to be easier than in countries that have already achieved higher levels of performance. And on the right-hand side, you see another small group of countries that have declined their student performance over time, including very top performing countries in the first cycles like Finland. So what has gone wrong? I mean, the main question that I want to ask is why hasn't this evidence led to an improvement in student outcomes, which was the most important mission that PISA defined for itself? If you read the PISA reports, PISA's own conclusion is that good practices have been correctly identified, but governments do not listen. And having been a policymaker, I have a different point of view. And in this talk, I'm going to develop other hypotheses. I'm going to be discussing what are the political costs of some of those education policies. I'm going to be discussing to what extent some policy recommendations are context dependent, and what are the difficulties involved there. And I'm also going to be arguing that some of the evidence is inconclusive and the policy recommendations drawn from this evidence may be wrong. So I am going to organize the different variables that PISA and other surveys have analyzed into 3 blocks. The first one is what I consider factors for which there is solid evidence. The main factor of what does not work in education is that there is no impact whatsoever of levels of investment above a certain threshold. In a second block, I include all those factors that are strongly context dependent. And as an example, I'm going to be discussing mainly school autonomy and the interaction with student assessments. And finally, there's a third block, which can be labeled equity, where I'm going to argue that the evidence is partial and inconclusive, and therefore the policy recommendations may be wrong. So if we look at the first block, where we do have solid evidence, what is this evidence? Well, basically, this evidence tells us that there's no impact of levels of investment on student performance above a certain threshold. So if you look at the blue line, you can see that it's a flat line. So above a certain level of investment per student, you don't have any improvements in student performance in those countries that invest more. So you have countries that invest comparatively little, like Estonia, with very high levels of student performance. And you have other countries that invest much, much more per student, like Luxembourg, and still their levels of student performance are much lower. And then it's a different story below this threshold, because in countries that invest very little in education, increases in investment do lead to increases in student performance. But since most of the OECD countries are well above this threshold, I'm going to concentrate on the countries above this threshold and the reasons why increased levels of investment don't lead to improvements in student performance. In my country, in Spain, there are huge differences between regions. So the average for the country in red actually hides major regional differences. And we have 17 regions. As you can see here, in green, the different regions, and in blue, the country where the level of performance is similar. And you can see that in some regions, levels of performance are as high as there are among some top performing countries. And in other regions on the right-hand side, you find that levels of performance are very low compared to low performing countries. And again, if you look at levels of investment in different regions in Spain, where the differences are huge, because in some regions like the Basque Country, levels of investment are double what other regions invest per student, we see that again, there's absolutely no relationship with levels of investment. And the same happens if you look at periods of time within a country where levels of investment have increased or decreased, but in general they increase, and you see no parallel increase in levels of student performance. So what does investment in education mean? So what is important to bear in mind is that 80% of investment in education goes to teacher salaries, goes to staff. So basically levels of investment is the product of two factors. On the one hand, the number of teachers, which is a consequence of class size, and on the other hand, teacher salaries. So the combination of teacher salaries and class size actually explains most of the investment in education by large. Here you see that there's absolutely no impact of teacher salaries on student performance. This is one of the reasons why levels of investment don't have an impact on student performance. And here we look at the other major factor which determines levels of investment, which is class size. And again, you see absolutely no relationship between class size and student performance. And this is mainly because those top performing countries in East Asia that we've seen in the rankings, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and so on, they have very large class sizes, and still they achieve very high levels of investment. But as you can see, most countries on the left-hand side have quite small class sizes, and they tend to be declining over time. And still, there's no improvement in terms of student performance. So when you look at where investment goes, you realize that whether it goes mostly into increasing teacher salaries or increasing teacher salaries, decreasing class size, or both, there's going to be no impact on student performance. And what do governments do? How do they react to this evidence, where this is one of the cases where governments do not follow the policy advice? Because as you can see here, you can see in green levels of investment and levels of investment per student. And in blue, the first bar for each country, it's the number of students. And what you can see is that spending over time, in this case, between 2012 and 2018, which is after the financial crisis, levels of investment have increased in most countries, despite the fact that in many of those countries, the number of students have decreased because of the demographic trends. So governments do continue to invest. What are the reasons? And here we see a combination of what different countries have done in terms of class size and teacher salaries, and what is the trend between 2015 and 2019. And basically what you see is that the levels of investment have increased, as we've just seen, because most countries have both decreased class size and increased teacher salaries. Sorry. Okay. So why are governments not paying attention to this very strong evidence that increased investment doesn't lead to improved student outcomes? Well, I would argue, having been in government, and in my case, I started as Secretary of State in the year 2012, when the financial crisis was hitting Spain at its worst. And we, as national government, did not decrease class size, but we did allow regional governments more flexibility so that they could decrease class size if they decided to do so. We paid a huge price for this decision. It had a huge political cost, which I think tainted the whole reform. This decision had absolutely nothing to do with the education reform, but after that, the reform was labeled the reform of the budget cuts. And it really did a lot of damage. The political cost was huge. So on the one hand, you have unions. For unions, class size is the major variable because it determines the number of teachers and therefore the size of the membership. So unions will always argue that governments need to decrease class size, and they will not explain, what are the underlying conflicts of interest. They will claim that class size equals education quality, and most people accept that this is the case. On the other hand, teachers demand increased salaries, and families do accept the assumption that investment equals quality. Therefore, there are huge political costs for any government that decreases either investment or any of the two factors that contribute to it the most, teacher salaries or class size. So there will be major conflicts with the unions, and there will be a huge political cost with society at large, because most people do accept that investment equals quality. So I would argue here that the political costs of accepting this policy recommendation are too high for most governments, but particularly where unions are most powerful, such as in Latin American countries. And as I explained, it's only in countries in East Asia where they have increased class size and therefore invest much more of the investment that goes into education into other issues such as teacher training and professional development and so on. Now, there's another block of variables which are strongly context dependent, and therefore it's difficult for policymakers to understand, what is it that they should do in the particular circumstances in which they find themselves. And I will use as an example the interaction between school autonomy and student assessment. So school autonomy can mean many things. I'm not going to go into detail in this, but it could mean how you distribute school resources, issues about curriculum, student assessment, student admission policies, or hiring teachers. I'm going to concentrate on school autonomy in relation to the curriculum. And here what we find, and I apologize for the poor quality of the slide, is that it's a very complex interaction. And these are not analysis from PISA, because PISA mainly publishes correlations which are not relevant to draw causal relationships. So this comes from more elaborate analysis from Hanushek and Bosman. And basically what you find is that first, school autonomy only leads to improved student outcomes in those systems where education quality is already high enough. And this is because you're transferring the responsibility of making a lot of decisions to principals and teachers. And if you do not make sure that teachers and principals already have the skills that are required to make the right decisions, then granting autonomy in education systems which are of poor quality will lead to a negative impact on student outcomes. The interaction is even more complex because when you grant school autonomy, the evidence shows that you should do it simultaneously with implementation of accountability mechanisms. And the main accountability mechanism, which is looking at student performance, are exit exams. So here what you find is an interaction between these three factors. So school autonomy only leads to an improvement in student performance in high quality education systems with highly skilled principals and teachers, but also the impact is much greater when you grant school autonomy in exchange for accountability, when you have, in this case, external exit exams. Otherwise, the impact is much lower. And in the case of poor performing education systems, the impact is negative. So one should be very careful about this policy recommendation. Now, what is the policy recommendation from PISA? The problem is that despite of the fact that it's strongly context dependent, and we have this complex interaction between the three factors, the quality of the education system, the level of autonomy, and the accountability mechanisms put in place, PISA actually makes a universal policy recommendation to grant greater school autonomy in most, if not all, education systems. So as we have seen in low quality education systems, this leads to a negative impact. And it forgets that many top performing systems, particularly those in East Asia, like Singapore and South Korea, have actually very low levels of school autonomy. So you don't seem to need it in order to reach those high levels of student performance. So the impact on education reforms has been very strong. A lot of governments have accepted this universal policy recommendation to grant more school autonomy, because for policymakers it's very difficult to understand where they are in that scale, whether they have already reached the level of quality that it's required for greater autonomy to have a positive impact. But often no accountability mechanisms are implemented because there's no rejection of giving more autonomy to schools. Unions, teachers, all the stakeholders tend to accept this measure as a positive one, but that is not the case with accountability mechanisms. There are strong forces against implementing accountability mechanisms, as I will explain. So not only countries that are poor performing implement autonomy before they are ready to do so, but they do not implement accountability mechanisms. And therefore, this policy recommendation often leads to worse outcomes rather than better outcomes. So what happens with assessments in particular? So in this case, besides not considering this complex interaction that I've just explained, PISA has changed its own conclusions over time, despite of the fact that the evidence that it provides with the correlations has not changed as far as I can tell. So in the first cycles, PISA correlations showed that student assessments had a large and positive impact on student performance, and therefore it recommended that countries implemented them. But then in successive cycles, it started diluting this policy recommendation basically by warning against the dangers of high stakes exams. which is student assessments with academic consequences. And then all the subsequent analysis followed on the uses of the student assessments rather than on whether there were assessments or not, how well or badly they were designed, the timing, the quality, the degree alignment with the curriculum, and so on. And then PISA correlations give this kind of results where if you look at the right-hand side, you find results which are surprising and that contradict what other authors that use more sophisticated statistical techniques find, such as if assessments are used to promote students to the next grade, then they have a negative impact. If they are used to improve curriculum or teacher practices, they have a negative impact, and so on. And again, it is not possible to draw causality from this kind of correlations. And still, this change in the policy recommendations has had an enormous impact. So many countries are reevaluating the need to have student assessments at the end of educational stages. This trend has been magnified by COVID because in many countries, these external assessments couldn't take place for a year or two, and therefore there's an ongoing debate about whether they should come back, and if so, whether they should be adapted to the current circumstances. In many more countries, rather than eliminating student assessments, what they've done is eliminate any academic consequences or dilute them, despite, as I said, very robust evidence showing that they have a very positive impact. And then the last block of factors that I'm going to be discussing, they can be all grouped under the label of equity. And here I argue that the evidence is very partial and inconclusive, and therefore leads to the wrong policy recommendations. This is a result that PISA has shown cycle after cycle, which basically shows that a student's socioeconomic background has a huge impact on student performance, but more so in some countries than others. So first, it has to be said that obviously it's more difficult to minimize the impact of family socioeconomic backgrounds in systems where students perform at a very high level. Because if students have very poor levels of performance, as you see on countries on the right-hand side, then it's easier for all of them to have similar levels of performance because they're all having very poor levels of performance. But still, if you look at the left-hand side, you find countries like Finland and Estonia, where levels of equity are high and levels of student performance are also high. From this type of graph, PISA concludes that there's no longer such a thing as poor countries with bad quality education systems and rich qualities with good quality education systems, because poor students in the lowest deciles of the distribution within each country, poor students in good performing education systems perform better than privileged students in poor performing education systems. But this is only part of the story because PISA looks at percentiles. So PISA doesn't take into account the fact that poor students in Finland, say, are not as poor as students in Colombia. So if you take into account the income per family, you find that unfortunately it is still true that poor students in rich countries perform better than rich students in poor ones, although the quality of education system does affect all the percentiles within each country. So if we compare how countries perform in terms of quality and equity, we find on the top right-hand side of the quadrant that there are some countries that have high levels of student performance and also high levels of equity, but these are just a handful. So it's true that they are not necessarily exclusive, but it's also true that there are a handful. So the issue is, if you have to decide whether you're going to have a high quality education system or an education system with high levels of equity, what is the priority? One of the problems with equity is that it's a multidimensional concept. So many variables, many different variables are used to evaluate equity. And the problem with PISA and the exclusive use of correlations is that it uses these different variables independently of each other. So it uses impact of socioeconomic background on student performance. It also uses between and within school differences, the percentage of resilient students and other variables. But each variable tells a different story. None of them tell the whole story. And as I will try to show, some of them tell the wrong story. So you actually need analysis which go beyond PISA correlations that take into account all these variables simultaneously. So the PISA policy recommendations on equity, despite the complexity and the fact that it's multidimensional and you need to look at many different variables at the same time, is actually very universal. It recommends to all countries that it uses inclusive practices. It recommends that anything that could be labeled as segregation, differential treatment of students is avoided, and this includes ability grouping, early vocational education and training tracking, and any form of differential treatment between students. This is a typical example of policy borrowing from Nordic countries, particularly the narrative built around the success of Finland. But my argument is that in countries with a large extent in the levels of equity, which is high in Nordic countries, you don't need to implement policies in order to improve equity to the same extent that you need in those countries that have very high levels of economic and social equity, such as Latin American countries. So PISA policy recommendations sometimes lead to very bad outcomes in terms of equity that PISA doesn't recognize because it doesn't look at variables such as early school leaving. So this policy recommendation to be very inclusive and comprehensive in countries with high levels of inequity, both social, economic, and in terms of skills, lead to high rates of grade repetition, to high rates of early school leaving, and high rates of youth unemployment, which have to do with the fact that in these countries there is huge heterogeneity between students because the level of skills of the adult population, it's not only low generally, but also very unequal. So some parents have a few parents have high levels of skills and many parents have very low levels of skills. So teachers have to deal with a degree of student heterogeneity, which is much larger than in countries with higher levels of equity, such as Nordic countries. So I will use Spain as a case study of why this policy recommendation can go badly wrong. So these are the headlines after the release of PISA 2012, when I was Secretary of State. The first one mentions that once again, Spain is performing below the OECD average. The second one highlights in a very positive note that it's a very equitable system, the third most equitable system according to the OECD. And the last one insists on the fact that the rates of grade repetition are very high. So here I'm just showing that it is true that Spain has been underperforming, both in science, reading and maths, in all the domains in PISA. And I think even more worryingly is the fact that it has been stagnated over time. But as I have just shown in the headline, the interpretation, the positive interpretation has been that this is really not that important because the most important thing is that Spain has sacrificed quality for the sake of equity and that equity for Spain is the priority. And I will try to show that this is definitely not the case. And this is not the case because PISA fails to take into account variables such as early school leaving. Here you have the average for the European Union, which is around 10–50%. As you can see in Spain, in red, early school leaving is an endemic problem, which has been around 30% for many years, and then decreased to 25% in 2011. And it is much higher than other European countries and other countries in Europe that suffered from high levels of early school leaving, such as Portugal, managed to solve the problem much earlier. So if you have more than 1 in 4 students that are leaving compulsory education without the degree of lower secondary education, you definitely have a big problem with equity. You cannot define this system as an equitable system or the third most equitable system in the OECD, because you're failing 30% of the students that start the school system. There's also a very strong link between grade repetition and early school leaving. So these students start lagging behind very early on. Because of these inclusive policies, the teachers treat all the classroom in the same way. As I said, there's no ability grouping, no way to give these struggling students the additional support that they require. So they start repeating grades and eventually they just leave school. And if you look here at the correlation when you compare regions, in those regions where grade repetition is very high, rates of early school leaving are also very high. So grade repetition, which PISA does measure, is a very good proxy for early school leaving in Spain and in other countries that suffer the same problems, such as countries in Latin America. So the ignored facts of the Spanish education system, which is praised by PISA as equitable since 2000 until the last cycle, is that it misses the important fact that 40% of the students repeat grade at least once, that grade repetition is a very good proxy of early school leaving, that early school leaving has been around 30% for many, many decades, and that these young people who live with really low levels of basic skills become neets and then face really high levels of youth unemployment for the rest of their lives. PISA conclusions are different. PISA concludes that grade repetition lowers student performance in a case of reverse causality, because it's students that are not performing well that repeat grades, of course. And it does claim that it's costly and inefficient, but it doesn't identify what are the causal factors. It claims that because within school differences are greater than between school differences, the system is very high in terms of equity. And this is a conceptual mistake. The reason why within school differences are so large is that you have so many students repeating grades, and therefore with major differences in student performance within the same school. It fails to make the link with early school leaving and therefore misses a major source of inequality. So the mantra that Spain has sacrificed quality for the sake of equity and that should be praised is a conclusion that it's wrong. With the education reform that we implemented in 2013, one of the things that we did was to modernize and make vocational education and training more attractive, something that PISA normally doesn't recommend. And by doing this, we did manage to decrease levels of early school leaving dramatically, the most dramatic decline in the history of the Spanish education system. So again, a policy recommendation that was not applicable to the Spanish case. And also this idea that in Spain, equity is the priority and the only thing that matters has led, strangely, in my view, to a complete lack of national evaluations. There are no national evaluations. There are no regional evaluations with common standards, as in other decentralized countries. Like Germany, most evaluations only include a sample of students, and with the recent education reform, regional governments are forbidden from linking any result from these assessments to individual students, teacher, or schools. And with the recent education reform, which was approved last year, even if teachers fail students, students will move on to the next grade and get their degree. Why? Well, these are all recommendations coming from the OECD, but the reason why these recommendations are accepted is very complex. For regional governments, national evaluations are a signal of re-centralization. So not having had national evaluations for so long, now whichever government tries to implement national evaluations will be accused of trying to re-centralize education. Unions reject student evaluations as an indirect form of teacher evaluations. Political parties on the left of the spectrum reject evaluations as discriminatory against students from underprivileged backgrounds, because as we have seen, they tend to have worse outcomes in assessment. So rather than seeing this as a good diagnostic of the failure of the education system to support these students, it just claims that the problem will go away by not having evaluations and therefore becoming a blind system, which is what we have these days in Spain. So PISA and Spain, what does PISA conclude about Spain in particular? It concludes that it's an education system which has prioritized equity over excellence. This does not take into account the fact that the high rates of grade repetition it identifies leads to very high rates of early school leaving, and that high rates of early school leaving, for obvious reasons, are the worst kind of inequity possible in any education system. And regional disparities are another major source of inequity, which are a consequence of the lack of national evaluations. PISA makes no recommendations about evaluations and just keeps warning about high stakes exams, which don't exist. So who is responsible for this failure to improve education systems by learning from good practices from top performers? According to the OECD, as I said, it's mainly that governments don't listen. And in fact, in the release of the results of PISA 2018, the OECD claims that PISA has become a yardstick for evaluating the quality and equity and efficiency of school systems, and an influential force in education reform. And it claims that it has helped policymakers by lowering the political action by backing difficult decisions with evidence, but it has also raised the political cost of inaction by exposing areas where policy and practice are unsatisfactory. In other words, what PISA concludes is that those policymakers that are willing to follow PISA recommendations will not face major political costs because the evidence makes those costs disappear somehow. And that when policymakers do not follow these recommendations, PISA can point fingers at them and show that they are not doing the right thing. I clearly develop an alternative view, and basically the summary of this presentation is that we have these three types of evidence. Each of them has different challenges. When we have solid evidence from international large-scale surveys, such as no impact of investment, there are major conflicts of interest because we're talking about teacher salaries, we're talking about class size, we're talking about major conflicts in unions, particularly in those parts of the world where unions are politically very powerful. And there's no evidence that this evidence that investment has no impact lowers the political cost for policymakers because the conflicts of interest are so strong. Then we have the second block of those factors that are strongly context dependent, such as the interaction between school autonomy and student assessments. And here the problem is that PISA makes universal policy recommendations when in fact it's strongly context dependent. So in some cases it might improve student outcomes, but in other cases it will have a negative impact. And finally, we have very partial and inconclusive evidence in relation to equity, a very complex, multidimensional concept. And here again, the policy recommendation is universal. And I would claim that the policy recommendation favoring inclusive policies and questioning all those policies that give different groups of students different levels of support, such as ability grouping or VET and so on, do have a positive impact in those countries where levels of student heterogeneity are very large and where the quality of the education system is low. So my view is that we need to start a much more open debate about the quality of the evidence, the strengths of the evidence. I personally am convinced that this kind of comparative evidence is badly needed, but we also need to challenge some of the policy recommendations which are not supported by the evidence, because as we have seen, they impact on improving the quality of education systems in OECD countries and other countries that have joined these surveys has been none, almost trivial. So thank you very much. And that's the end of the presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it.